Look, thank you so much. I think you really covered problem definition of what you were trying to solve. A really good discussion about that level of independence and the pros and cons, and a real good clarity around what you do and what you don't do. So look, I'd really like to invite our panel up here to delve into this discussion a little bit more. We have Anna Chau, Acting CEO of Infrastructure Australia. I apologise, just to be a wee bit clunky as people just come on as we go. We've got Jim Betts, Chief Executive of Infrastructure New South Wales. Got Michel Masson, Chief Executive of Infrastructure Victoria, and Allan Garcia, Chief Executive of Infrastructure Tasmania. And as a board member of Infrastructure New Zealand, I don't really have a stone to throw, but my God, we could do with some more innovation in those naming rights, couldn't we? Let's just not have infrastructure followed by. And finally, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, David Larocca, Head of Transactions and Infrastructure for Oceania at EY. EY remain the only Big Four firm with a long-term track record as an integrated partnership across Australia and New Zealand and seamlessly connected infrastructure team of more than 300 professionals. Our clients experience this difference and benefit on every engagement. David is here this week by happy coincidence, bringing his specialist expertise to one of our clients, and has been able to stay on an extra day or so that he can run this panel. Since he operates in Sydney, he knows these people, and I want to get off the stage before my voice cracks out. So I've asked David to facilitate this session and really delve in with this powerful group what an iBody could look like in New Zealand. Thank you very much, David.
Well, thank you, Grant, and good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be hosting this panel on a really big topic, which is leadership and strategy in infrastructure. And if we just think about it, just 10 years ago, there really weren't any of these iBodies around, probably anywhere in the world, let alone in the countries we're going to be talking about this morning. And now we have iBodies, certainly in Australia, in the UK, in Canada, and there's discussions emerging in the US, and obviously a discussion here in New Zealand. So really fortunate to have a fantastic panel of leaders who are influencing infrastructure in their markets, policy, strategy, and in some cases also keeping an eye on implementation. So my objective here is to generate a bit of discussion, obviously, that draws out each of your experiences, the differences, because there are differences across your models, and ultimately advice you would give to someone that's about to set up an iBody. As Nadine mentioned earlier today, please do fire in your questions. I want to ask an iBody a question from an iPad, so I think that would be really cool to say to my kids when I go home tonight. But look, I might open the questioning, and Katie, you gave a really great overview of how you're set up, your experiences, particularly around independence. I might ask our other panel members just to give some fast facts about how you're set up, what your remit is, your governance. And I might start with Anna Chau. Infrastructure Australia has just been through their 10-year anniversary and has actually endured two changes of government. So I thought we'd start with Anna.
Thanks, David. Hi, my name's Anna Chau from Infrastructure Australia. Infrastructure Australia is the independent advisory body on infrastructure investment to all three levels of government in Australia. We were established by the Infrastructure Australia Act in 2008. The Act was amended in 2014, whereby we had appointed a CEO and we report to an independent board. We have just celebrated our 10th anniversary, so we've been around for some time, and during this time there's been a lot of growth and also development in terms of our processes. Our two main core functions are policy and research, which develops our policy positions and our reform agenda, and project advisory, which I lead, normally in developing our national priority list, which is a tool by which we use to prioritise and progress nationally significant projects. Our remit covers economic and social infrastructure. Primarily in the economic space would be transport, water, energy and telecommunications. In the social infrastructure space, some of our main work has been in education, primarily universities. So it's quite broad. We don't do defence, that's probably outside our remit. And any state and territory governments seeking Commonwealth funding in excess of $100 million need to come to us for a formal evaluation with their business case, which they submit.
Great, thanks Anna. I might go to the end. Jim, your organisation has been around for about 7 years now.
Yeah, it has. So established by statute back in 2011 by the incoming coalition government in New South Wales. I'll talk a bit about the functions later on, but it's an organisation of 35 people. We've got a budget of about $11 to $12 million Australian per annum, so pretty small budget, pretty small team. It means we're all on one floor. We all know each other. So we're a fairly agile organisation, fairly flat, non-hierarchical sort of body, which is good. We've got I report to the Premier, but I report through a board which has 4 heads of government department on it, but a majority of independent directors, including the chair, Graham Bradley, who has a strong background as a non-executive director in companies like Stockland and elsewhere. Report to the Premier, have a seat on the Cabinet Infrastructure Committee, so we are very much in the room. So the concept of independence does not equate to the concept of isolation, and that's a theme which we might come back to during the course of the discussion.
Right. Michel.
So Infrastructure Victoria was set up in October 2015 via a Parliament Act, so we were created by law. And our independence is unique in a sense that it is absolutely embedded in the law when you can see that it is clearly written, the Minister cannot direct the activity of Infrastructure Victoria, which is quite unique. So we are a pretty small team. We see ourselves a little bit like Jim, like the little startup from the Silicon Valley within the Victorian Public Service, more a jazz band and a Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. There's about 32 of us with an annual budget set by Parliament at $10 million per year. And we really fulfill 3 main functions. The first one is to provide that long-term strategy on a regular basis. The very first ever 30-year infrastructure strategy in Victoria was tabled in Parliament in December 2016, to which the government had to publicly respond to. And we were certainly very pleased to see that 134 out of 137 recommendations were approved in part, in principle, or in full. And the second thing that we're doing is to provide advice on a request from the Victorian government on anything that they want. And that's a way sometimes to take the political heat out of some debate, as was the case for the very first request for advice, which the government wisely asked us to provide, which is where should the second container port of Melbourne be, being very prescriptive between 2 locations, which each location was strongly being barracked for by a political persuasion. So you never get a second chance to make a first impression, I can tell you. And the third thing that we are doing is to conduct policy research completely independently, which enables us to really tackle the controversial issues and the conversations that we need to have, think transport network pricing, for instance, really preparing for the long policy reforms that as Victoria we need in the future.
Great, thanks Michel. Finish with you, Allan.
Katie referenced her organisation as a fragile one. Probably mine's in that category. Not established by legislation. I report, my organisation reports to the Treasurer and the Minister for Infrastructure. We're as independent as my contract allows me to be as a good public servant. Frank and fearless advice on all things infrastructure, but our responsibilities are long-term planning for the state of Tasmania. And also, we've had a role, I suppose, in our inaugural few years of troubleshooting for government, fixing their infrastructure problems and giving them advice as to where they need to invest and what they need to do to fix some of the problems of the past. We are an organisation that's been loved by this government because they established us and then they got re-elected, but we are not an organisation loved by the opposition. So it's a question as to whether or not the entity, I think in general terms, the principles around the entity are fine. I'm just not so sure in terms of bipartisan whether we have a role in the future or an alternative entity has that role. But I expect the long-term infrastructure planning will be a continuation for any government in the future.
Great. So there's a couple of questions popping up around independence. So I thought I'd start there. It's a fairly easy topic to cover. Obviously many versions of independence, and you've got a feel for that from the panel members in their descriptions and also Katie's presentation. Maybe Katie, if I start with you, does it really work? And ultimately, what's in it for ministers?
So I would say that we have been given the freedom to work very independently so far, and that's been key to building support for what we said. So I think what's in it for ministers, I think there's a value to having a neutral voice in the debate. someone that's putting groundbreaking work out there so that debates can be moved forward. They often get stuck in a sort of very political rut. And also we can think about questions in a public forum in a way that government can't, which means they're quite happy sometimes for us to get on and do that so that they can be seen to be removed from us in a way. So I think it benefits both parties for us to be independent.
Right. Michel, you recently put out a groundbreaking plan in Victoria. Any comments on independence and how your experiences around independence?
No, absolutely. Independence might be in the legislation, but it's mostly what you do, with your independence. And really, what's in there for the government, it's an ability to have an additional source of very strong evidence-based, but also an organization that creates the debate and goes and talks to the communities in respect of what they, don't have either on their agenda or what is being controversial. I'll give you an anecdote. When we released in October 2016 our draft strategy, we had as one of the top 3 transformative recommendations, transport network pricing. Within 2 hours of having released the document, the Premier and the Leader of the Opposition went on air and basically ruled it out and said this is not, on our agenda. Lo and behold, when we tabled our final strategy in Parliament 3 months later, transport network pricing was still there, and the community went, yes, you stuck to your gun. And ultimately, what both sides of politics, told us quietly is, I told publicly what I had to say, but I'm actually supportive of you continuing to have that debate and nurture it, because we need to actually make sure to find a path forward with the community on how we can progress on that very hard and controversial issue. So to answer your question, it provides for a minister that ability to see someone running with a controversial issue, stand back and see how the media is reacting, how the community is reacting, in order to really see how the timing for that policy reform will actually unfold. And as for everything, timing is not everything. Timing is the only thing when it comes to those policy reforms.
Right. Jim, obviously independence can create tension as well, and early on in your organisation, before your time of course,
Yes.
tension did emerge. Just any observations from you?
Yes, so the rich history of infrastructure in New South Wales shows you the upsides and the potential risks associated with setting up an independent body. And I would say that the main lesson is you can spend a lot of time thinking about the architecture, the governance structure, the legislative framework, but if you put a dickhead in charge of the organisation, it'll be a disaster.
It's a technical term for anyone in the room.
That's an Australian term, probably not used in New Zealand. Actually, as we know, all organisations' cultures are set by and large from the top. And so the choice of CEO, the choice of chair, the choice of the personnel on the board, the other senior executives, those are the most important choices that will be made in the establishment of any organisation. Independence, the virtues of independence have been described very articulately already. I would also point to the independence within government, which is not being beholden to Treasury, not being subject to ad hoc direction by individual ministers, particularly spending ministers who will always have a personal agenda, and that's legitimate, that's their job. So I report to the Premier, but she acts as though I'm independent, and the mandate she gives me is to give her frank and fearless advice, which I do courteously and I do confidentially, except where otherwise agreed. So I'm not out there throwing bombs, and I'm not out there trying to raise the profile of my organisation for the sake of it. I would trade influence against independence any day of the week. But the two go together, because the independence and the perception of independence and not being beholden to any particular minister or political party goes to the question of credibility with the community and therefore the integrity of the advice that you provide. And a lot of the conversations I have with people in government are about their saying, we would like you to do such and such, but we don't want you to do it if you feel that it would compromise your independence and your integrity, because that in itself has value for us, because it is seen to support our decisions or to improve the quality of our decisions.
Right. Anna, from an Infrastructure Australia perspective?
I think over the 10 years we've seen numerous benefits in terms of, one, in terms of policy debate, it's good to have an independent voice. Sometimes we can, well, all the time, we can say things that government can't, but also to have a fully informed debate, which I think an independent organisation really can target. At the projects level, clearly, you know, the credibility of a project business case that's been through rigorous assessment, it's been through internal challenges at the board level as well, gives it a lot more credibility. And I think government has actually learned to recognise that. Our infrastructure priority list is effectively a menu for decision makers and politicians in terms of, you know, what are good things to invest in that would actually improve the nation's productivity, that would actually improve the quality of life. And that success has been borne out in, I think, one of the last elections where we saw both sides of politics really looking at backing some of the priorities that we've listed on priority lists. And most recently, the Commonwealth May budget, where almost 80% of the funding commitments came from the infrastructure priority list. So I think that's really a testament to the success of having independent project evaluation. Look, I think we're fairly pragmatic in that, you know, I don't think it's entirely possible to take politics out of project selection, but what an independent body can do is to at least give that advice and actually use transparency to say, what are the costs, what are the benefits? There may also be some unquantified strategic benefits that people can take into account.
Great. Allan, obviously you've got a different model around independence and you're starting to touch on some of those challenges.
Yeah, look, I think from the perspective of my organisation, the government calls me independent. We're not quite in the same realm as an Auditor General, and so we don't report to Parliament. But certainly the government uses us as an independent body. They call us arm's length. Bit of a challenge at times, but I think in terms of the perception from the public, we're seen to be an independent provider of advice to government. You know, a bit like, I mean, as Jim talks about, you know, you have a cosy relationship with the Premier and the Treasurer and your ministers. You sort of get a bit of a feel for what they want. You want to give the advice that's the best for them. So I think that we use, I suppose our level of independence is in filtering that advice and working that advice around to give the best possible outcome in a frank and fearless but courteous way. But we're not, you know, I don't report to a board, so we don't have an august group of people that sort of that are perceived to be independent. But we use a lot of external advice to support, I suppose, our assumptions. So it's a limited independence. I don't think it's the independence that maybe everyone in the audience is looking for, but at the moment it works for us. I'd probably prefer to have something like the New South Wales model, personally, but you know, I'm living with what I'm living with.
Great. So I might shift the discussion from governance to scope, so what you do, what you don't do. Obviously lots of common ground. You all have a really clear mandate around strategic plans, so I might start there. Let's start with the sort of common areas. Just maybe share the process you've all been through in delivering strategic plans, and particularly interactions with government and community, and then obviously the outcomes they've achieved. So Katie, I know you've talked a bit about this earlier, but if you could elaborate a bit about your experience.
Yeah, sure. So to put together the National Infrastructure Assessment, there was a huge amount of work involved, obviously. We commissioned a lot of research. We work very closely with government departments, so obviously we are a much smaller organisation than any of them, so where possible we drew on some of their analytical capability as well. We did a lot of engagement. We went out around the country and spoke to people, to local leaders. We did some social research to understand what people want from their infrastructure. I mean, drew that all together into a set of recommendations.
Great. Michel, maybe from your perspective, particularly because community engagement's been a big part of your plan?
Yeah, absolutely. We're very strong on the fact that a good long-term planning has got two sides of a coin. The first one is the strength of the evidence and the research and the modeling, but that's not, you know, that's not it all. The other side of the coin is the engagement and the consultation with the community, the civic engagement with the business leaders. And really, we approach that strategy by talking to a lot of people and say, what do you want to see in that 30-year strategy? At first, people were taken a little bit aback and say, well, what do you mean? You are the expert. You tell us. And say, no, we're not interested in to produce just a report. We're interested in to produce something that reflects what truly you see are the barriers, to your success, that if that was highlighted to the government and paid attention to, you would be in a better position to actually go about your business. And that unleashed a complete different dynamic and approach, to the extent that when we tabled our report in Parliament, it was no longer our report, it was actually that of the Victorian community, and was the beginning of a discussion rather than the end of the discussion. And in that community engagement, we use many different approaches, including one called the citizen juries. It's a form of deliberative democracies. When you take 40 citizens randomly selected, they meet for 6 Saturdays over 3 months. They're providing transparently with all of the evidence that we have. They can call on to any experts, and they actually provide their recommendations at the end. It is amazing, ladies and gentlemen, what you get when you take 40 people and you engage with them outside of the 140-character debate, out of fake news, and you get what is sadly so uncommon, which is common sense. And when politicians tell me that transport network pricing, I'm not so sure, I'm very pleased to remind them that both citizen juries, the one in the regional Victoria and in Metropolitan, all heartedly endorse this as one of the most fundamental reforms that Victoria needed.
Right. Jim, I might come to you. There's the second question from the top there around balancing the democratic decision-making of governments with achieving long-term planning for infrastructure. I guess my question is, you've also dovetailed your plans in with other plans. Maybe share a bit of that experience.
Yeah, that's right. So in March this year, New South Wales government produced 3 major plans: a long-term transport master plan, a land use plan for the Greater Sydney area, supported by a whole series of regional plans, and a state infrastructure strategy. And those were produced by 3 different agencies within government, but they were produced through a process of collaboration over an 18-month period, starting off with a whole series of common planning assumptions, and then interactive discussion between agencies. We reserved our independence through that, but our thinking was greatly enriched by having access to the expertise and the analytical capability of the Transport Agency and the land use planners in the Department of Planning and Environment and in the Greater Sydney Commission. And what the government got at the end of it was integrated advice which was internally consistent. Infrastructure is not an end in itself. Infrastructure is about supporting housing, it's about supporting jobs, it's about supporting livability and economic growth. And therefore, sitting in your infrastructure silo, it's very hard to specify what are the right priorities without an understanding of the context in which you're making your recommendations. So it was great for us to have a schema in terms of land use and economic development into which we could then plug infrastructure recommendations. It was a very good collaborative process, but the collaboration in no way compromised the independence. In fact, it kind of enriched the whole process, having independent voices brought to it who weren't being dictated to or trammelled by political direction.
Right. Anna, from a national government perspective?
Thanks, David. Look, I think there is quite a lot of misconceptions about what Infrastructure Australia does, because we don't plan. Planning powers for land transport is with the states and territories, my colleagues here, and the Commonwealth Department of Infrastructure looks after aviation and maritime, and we don't allocate funding, and we don't implement. So at the end of the day, our core remit is to advise, but that is actually quite a wide remit. And we start with our National Infrastructure Audit, which is really the same as the Commission's infrastructure assessment. Our audit basically is a structured evidence-based approach to identifying where the infrastructure gaps are and where the infrastructure needs are. In particular, really understanding what is the problem we're trying to solve, especially when you look at the root causes of what we see as infrastructure problems: aging population, fast-growing population, aging infrastructure, such as networks. We then look at also the symptoms in terms of how that manifests into urban congestion in some cases, but also lack of accessibility for regions and remote communities. So using that evidence base that the audit provides, we then look into what could be the solutions as well, and that we do in consultation with the states and territories and private sector organisation. And through that comes the consensus approach to an infrastructure priority list. So that's really kind of the process we go through.
Great, thanks. And I might bring in the third question from the top there, which is around the topic of strategic planning, but I guess it's zeroing in on how do you make sure they survive election terms. I think that's where that question's getting at. Maybe throw it open to the panel, any observations there?
So Infrastructure Australia's planning horizon's over 15 years, and that we track through the infrastructure priority list in terms of when a nationally significant problem or opportunity is identified, it kind of then goes through different stages of options assessment, ensuring that not only have we found the right problem, what is the problem we're trying to solve here, have we actually got the right solutions? Because I think too often, a lot of projects are solutions driven. They jump in a solution. Many projects actually have solutions in search of a problem. We're still trying to figure out, what is the problem we're trying to solve here. So I think increasingly, states and territories also recognise this, that it's important to actually identify what is the problem first.
Can I say, look, we're in the throes of doing a 30-year infrastructure strategy, and it rolls off the tongue really easily. But when you actually get down to it and you start speaking to your stakeholders about, well, what does 30 years look like for you? Most infrastructure providers are good at 10. They're not bad at 15. They're pretty hopeless at 20. And at 30, they haven't even begun to think about what it might look like. So when you're actually charged with doing the development of one of these things, and you've got to involve the democratic process and go and speak to the people who are still looking at today's solutions to today's problems without understanding what tomorrow's problems are, let alone what tomorrow's solutions look like, it becomes quite challenging. So issues around whether or not future governments are going to abide by your 30-year strategy really come down to how deliberative you're going to be within your strategy. If you're going to have a 30-year list of projects, the likelihood is you're going to get your plans scrapped by the next government. But if you've got pathways to the needs and I can identify the challenges that are there, and if it is about transport in cities in the north, or if it's about better connectivity, or it is about how we're going to be dealing with digital technology and what 5G is going to need in terms of sensors and the like, and do we need to have space stations for drones or whatever the transport outcome might be. I mean, that's where we've got to try and take the thinking 30 years out. Now, you can't just pitch to 30 years, there's got to be a pathway, but I think the issue is, if it's, Michel talked about being evidence-based and being communicative with your community in terms of coming to a position on your 30-year strategy. If your 30-year strategy is robust and it is future-looking without being unrealistic, I think there's a greater opportunity for incoming governments to take a look at that and say, well, the general flavour's okay, it's not locking us down to specific projects, we can cope with the direction. So I think if it's done that way, I think it'll be okay.
Right. Michel, you were going to jump in.
I'd like to reinforce that very important point that Allan is making. A 30-year strategy is by no way coming and forcefully say this is what the future is going to look like in 30 years. The reason why 30-year horizon is actually good is that enables you to sequence what options could be, looking both at big cross-generational capital projects, but also what are the reforms and the policies and the quick wins that you can do right now. Let me illustrate that with a concrete example. We came out in our 30-year strategy basically saying Melbourne needs a rail link to the airport. Of course we do need one, but we don't need it now. We need it in the 15-30-year horizon. Shock horror, what do you mean? We need it yesterday. It's an absolute, disaster to go to the airport. We say, well, let's go back to what problem we're trying to solve. Most of the congestion that occurs between the airport and the city is not linked to traffic between the airport and the city. So let's alleviate that congestion, and this is why the number one priority is to finalize the orbital circuit and route around Melbourne by building a missing link, which is a big road which is called Northeast Link. That will take congestion and traffic out of the Tullamarine Freeway between the airport and the city, which, as we speak, is being widened, creating more capacity. And if you couple that with another one of our recommendation, which is to provide more capacity for a bus route, which currently goes between the airport and the city, and caters for 14% already of the market share, you've got enough to absorb the capacity with sensitivities between the city and the airport for the next 10 to 12 years. And when we came out publicly with this, people say, wow, that makes a lot of sense. Why don't we hear that more often? Instead of that, we need this and we need it now. That's why you need a 30-year horizon.
Katie, did you want to?
Yeah, I'd fully echo that. I mean, another example from what we've put together is talking about how cities need more investment. Now, actually, most of the budget for transport over the next 10 years in the UK is delivering a high-speed rail link between cities. But what was surprising to us when we came to try and put together a 30-year sort of strategy was that we thought we would receive a lot more project proposals than we did. Actually, what we got was a list of projects that people have been talking about for a very long time. And when those hadn't been taken forward, sometimes that was for a good reason. So what we are hoping, our plan is not a list of projects. What we are hoping is by setting out that vision, we can enable better projects to be developed over that long-term horizon. So by saying we want better transport in our cities, and we want some of those to be big transformational investments, but we don't actually have any money to do that for another 10 years, means that the next 10 years can be spent thinking about and developing those plans whilst putting in place some of the interim solutions like the one you talk about. So, yeah.
So still in the topic of what do you do, I'd like to explore some of the differences, some of the things you don't do or you sort of keep an eye on. Maybe starting with implementation or delivery, and Jim, maybe starting with you. INSW has stepped in to deliver some projects and is now delivering stadiums. Just some experiences from you on your, I guess, balancing that strategic planning to actually getting in there and delivering projects.
Thanks for mentioning the stadiums. Really
It's
appreciate
kind of
that.
public.
Yeah, I know, it's not a secret, unfortunately. Initially we were set up to do two main things: long-term strategic planning and to have the capacity to step in to projects and deliver them on behalf of government agencies, or rather step in really when the government agencies had stuffed them up and the Premier wanted to send in the cavalry. And that induced absolute paranoia in the rest of government. And fear, and understandably so, actually. So we started off, we just had...
And you own a whole bunch of horses, I assume, being the cavalry that's going to...
That's right, we're very well equipped with armaments as well. So we were given all these legislative weapons, and one of the first cultural changes that I needed to instigate in my department was actually to lay down their legislative weapons, stop talking about the Act, stop talking about our power to do things. And the history of INSW is one of gradual rehabilitation after initially crashing and burning in 2013, where we've been trusted to take on more functions, trusted to take on gateway reviews and assurance functions. So we see the whole of the government's capital program, and that gives us a really rich source of data to pick out cross-cutting themes like an overheated construction market and speak with authority to government about what needs to be done in response. But another function that we've taken on is to be a mobile project delivery agency, by which we mean a procurer of projects, not an actual physical deliverer, which is not dissimilar to, say, Major Projects Victoria, as it used to be called, where there are agencies that don't have a mature in-house delivery capability because they're arts organisations or they're sports organisations. Let's set up a centre of excellence within government that can go and build stuff for those agencies when they're given some capital. So we don't go into transport, we don't go into health because they know what they're doing by and large, but for the other agencies where it would make no sense for them to set up their own capital delivery agency because they don't have the critical mass, that's where we come in. And I guess there's a good question about whether there's a happy coexistence between a planning culture and a project delivery culture, particularly within an organisation of 35. At the moment it works well because we're seen to be successful in delivering projects, but the moment we stuff a project up, then our capacity to criticise other agencies for not managing their capital program effectively will be severely compromised, I suspect.
Yes. Michel, you're obviously not involved in delivery. Any comments from a Victorian perspective?
Yes, it's interesting because Victoria took that approach, how do we combine strategic planning and delivery, by basically creating two different organizations. So Infrastructure Victoria, we're squarely in the strategic planning and in the advice. We're not in the procurement, we're not in the delivery, nor in the quality assurance. There is another agency called the Office of Projects Victoria, which sits within Department Treasury and Finance, and which really aims at looking, first of all, how do we build the capability and the capacity and the consistency of that ability to deliver across the various departments and agencies in light of the tsunami of projects and the multi-billion dollars that we've got, not just for tomorrow, but for the foreseeable 10 years. The second thing that they're doing, exactly as Jim was saying, is that they act as the cavalry arriving when a project starts going astray. And the cultural aspect of what Jim mentioned is fundamental, and that's why in the Victorian context, I think that having those two entities, separate, is actually a good thing, because we forcefully come in favor of projects, and the government is absolutely free to make up whatever decisions they want and actually go for another one. So if this other project actually goes astray, there is another entity to actually deal with it, and that does not compromise the purity, so to speak, of our initial thinking and the evidence that we've actually put out. And notwithstanding the fact that you're talking about two complete different nature of capabilities and experience, which on a governance perspective also calls for different thinking and different people. You will not constitute the same board if your eye body is around the strategic planning than you will do if it is looking at how do you lift the delivery capabilities. This is not the same trade.
And IA has published a whole bunch of papers on some pretty big reform topics. Public transport franchising, water reform, road user charging. Maybe share how that's been received and whether that's nudging government into a particular direction.
The reform series have had 4 major papers. Certainly a lot of it has been contributing to the debate. Our position on value capture, for example, has been very much, it's really a financing issue in terms of funding, whereas not really in that kind of economic evaluation space, and very much need to kind of come away from that. It's the magic bullet for all projects in terms of value capture. Public transport franchising fairly much sees the value of contestability in markets and trying to get transport markets to that higher level of maturity. We've also had a paper on urban water reform, and that's really a national market issue. Last but not least, one of our papers is on corridor preservation, which is really important in terms of long-term strategic planning. You may not have the money to do it now, but if it's a good thing to do, and it's something that will come on stream later, then it's a question of how can you protect that corridor to minimise the costs of building that project later on when it is needed. I mean, a lot of infrastructure planning and delivery is really matching supply and demand. I think, the time where we had the luxury of building lots and lots of capacity in advance of demand, I think, is gone. So it's a question of how well can you time that delivery of additional supply and capacity to demand. I think it's also worth mentioning our Future Cities paper that was launched back in February. That looked at really 3 different scenarios for how a city can grow and what are the costs and benefits and the consequences of that would be. And that really was to try and show that you could have your quarter-acre block, but what does that entail in terms of would that be on the fringe of the metropolitan city, and would that mean an hour-and-a-half commute to work, as opposed to a more intensely densified scenario and a third way as well. So we've contributed quite a lot to that policy space, and something we're continuing to do. Our latest paper was also on infrastructure principles, which is best practice. So one of the key advocacy roles that Infrastructure Australia play is how do we get infrastructure planning and delivery to be at best practice? And whilst we're not always there, at least we actually set the bar there.
So we're coming towards the end of our panel session. I'd like to close on bringing back to New Zealand here, and I guess advice that you would give, given your experiences, and then a couple of questions popping up around what should a New Zealand iBody do, what role should it play. Maybe if we close on if you were setting up an iBody from scratch, what advice would you give New Zealand? Katie, maybe start with you.
So I think it goes back to, again, like real clarity of purpose. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? And then picking up on some of the other things that the panellists have said. So actually, how do you make sure that it has the space to do the thinking that you want it to do? And no matter what its degree of like formal independence, how are you allowing it, how are you giving it that space to work and be influential and be able to build a consensus?
Right.
Look, I think it's exactly that. What do you want to do? Is it about a strategy? Is it about delivery? New Zealand suffers the same issue as Tasmania in terms of the fact that we're a little bit away from the mainland. You've got a market that's got a certain capability, and when you get a new government that makes a lot of infrastructure promises and on delivery, how are you going to respond to that? So, you know, is there a role in so we deliver a pipeline that gives industry certainty at least for 10 years of what's coming down the pipeline. Should the iBody be involved in that aggregation, working with industry on how they can participate? Like, I really think it comes down to landing a position and then sticking to it. I think iBodies can grow or they can contract, but I think having a firm view on what you wanted to achieve in the first instance, and that can take a little while to work up, but you know, getting some consensus about what it should be doing is the important element.
Wholeheartedly agree on the purpose issue. You know, we very much always go back to what is the problem we're trying to solve. I'm sure Allan's team's heard me ask that several times on project business cases. Very much comes back to, you know, what is the problem at hand. And I think if, you know, New Zealand does decide to go down the independent agency route, I think it's important to recognise that independence doesn't mean independent kind of economic regulator type of role where it is very much, you know, they go away, do their analysis, come back with a judgment. I think it's much more around collaborative working and actually having early engagement on either policy positions as well as on project priorities as well. So I think collaboration and industry working should be seen as part of independence as opposed to just working in isolation and providing advice.
Great.
I would add two things to what my colleagues have said. And the first one is really a message to the New Zealand government. Do not create this body with a timeline of your electoral term. Think about it as a standing, ongoing organization. You are today within the government, you know, as a government, you will be tomorrow in the opposition. And there will be a cycle. So in setting the terms and references of this organization as to how independent you want it to be, the level of transparency that this organization and flexibility can have in, you know, transparently publishing all of the research and all of the evidence need to be thought in the long term, not just for this electoral cycle. And the second comment that I would make is it's all about the culture when that organization is going to be set up. So really think, you know, as to who is going to be the chairman of the board, how, you know, you're going to elect the board, and who you appoint as the leader in this organization. Because as I said before, you never get a second chance to make a first impression.
Yes, I think I said the last point, but in slightly more colourful terms than you did, but, and that is absolutely critical. The other thing I'd say is, and no disrespect to anyone in this room, you need an organisation that can find its way around government, because at the end of the day it's about influencing government, and you can bring in hotshots from the private sector, you can bring in people who are very, very smart at what they do, but the actual practical outcome has to be recommendations directed at the government, which hopefully the government, if not now, at some point in the future, will be able to accept and act upon. And it's surprising how hard people who are unfamiliar with government find it actually to get traction. So you don't need it to be a bunch of dyed-in-the-wool cardigan-wearing bureaucrats like me, but you do need people who can build coalitions of the willing within government and make the system work in favour of decisive action. And that's a fairly rarefied skill.
Great. Well, look, I might bring the session to a close. I think it's been a fantastic discussion. I guess a couple of takeaways I have are, you've heard focus on the problem, not the solution, quite a bit today. It's easy to get caught up in governance and independence and all the sort of inputs, but really a clear focus on the outcomes. And the second one is, I guess where Jim was going at the end there, is just not get caught up in self-interest and focus on what's best for the economy and growth. And you've all obviously contributing on that front. So please join me in thanking a fantastic panel that I've had a pleasure to host this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.